I think you're all to be commended for your perseverance, because we're no longer the 400th anniversary, 401st anniversary. I suppose we've been planning this for a while. I'm here, but I'll ask Sarah questions along the way, but my main job is to introduce Sarah, who's the Public Engagement and Events Officer of the About Face project at the University of York. But I know her, and then the reason she's here is because she's a historian of Puritanism on both sides of the Atlantic. She's researched Puritan communities and social networks and correspondence, which is obviously the center of what she's going to be talking about today, on both sides of the Atlantic and across the Atlantic. Right now, she's writing a book chapter entitled Trust and Credit, Merchants' Roles in Puritan News Networks, which actually again also sounds a little related to what we're hearing about, but in another dimension. And her presentation today is entitled These Poor Fruits of My Pen, Puritan Sociability and Transatlantic Correspondence in the Mid-17th Century. Now, I think embedded within that title, there are two themes right there, Puritan sociability and correspondence or letters. And I guess just to get Sarah going, I expect her to talk about letters. And there's a way historians usually use letters, which is basically to read them, look for information, and report on what the letter said. And there are all sorts of other ways to use letters as historical sources. And I guess I want to hear Sarah talk about that. And I know she has an important example from the early Plymouth colonies. So Sarah?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, and thanks everyone for coming tonight. I was, normally I would be saying thanks for coming out on such a hideous wet day, but I suppose it does make it a bit easier when we're all able to stay safely in our own homes. But yeah, I guess so when it comes to letters, I for my PhD, I read 1,626 letters, a number of which I don't think I'll ever forget because it took quite some time. And a few of these that really stood out for me are the ones that I kind of want to use as examples today. I won't tell you about all of them, I promise. So I guess a key one to really get us thinking today is on the 11th of December in 1621, Edward Winslow, who you may know about, he was a leading member of the Plymouth colony and he sailed on the Mayflower. He wrote to a friend in England, addressing his loving and old friend. He wrote, "Although I received no letter from you by this ship, I know you expect the performance of my promise, which was to write to you truly and faithfully of all things." So in these opening few lines alone, Winslow's letter really reveals to us some of the biggest challenges of transatlantic connection. So correspondence was really slow. Letters required ships to travel. There was no postal service in this time, so then nothing was official, nothing was regulated. And the ships usually took at least 6 weeks to cross the Atlantic. And Winslow had clearly promised to tell his old friend in England about his current situation, but he wasn't receiving any letters in return. So could this have been because his friend hadn't received his previous letters, or perhaps his friend's replies weren't making it to Plymouth? Like, Winslow couldn't know these things. There was no way for him to find this out. So on this occasion, he chose to just write a very brief account. Well, brief for the Puritans, which is actually quite lengthy, but brief for me when I was doing my research, so it was quite nice. So he wrote, yes, like I said, this brief account, referring his friend to previous letters that he'd sent for further satisfaction. He also asked his friend to give God thanks on behalf of the Plymouth colonists for dealing with them favourably. And that's kind of an interesting thing as well, and we can maybe come back to this later, but the Plymouth colonists had not been dealt with favourably at all. They'd just had their first successful harvest, which is, I suppose, what he's referring to, but this came after a long year of death and illness and malnourishment. So Winslow's letter gives us an account of the state of affairs in Plymouth, relationships with the native population, the climate, abundance of flora and fauna, which are all quite common themes of these early letters, opportunities for trade, because obviously this had to be a financially viable project as well, and a really important account for historians of the event that we now commonly remember as the first ever Thanksgiving. This is actually the only surviving eyewitness account that we have of that event. And it's obviously an event that's formed such an important part of American culture and this foundational myth, and it's become embedded in popular tradition. So letters like this are a really familiar part of transatlantic communication. Writers often sent the same information in multiple letters, and they would send it on different ships and at different times. And this would increase their chances of reaching the intended destination and in the timeliest manner possible. They asked friends and family members when they received these letters to pass on the information to other people in their networks in England, employing chains of communication that really increased efficiency and ensured that important news really did reach everyone. So for me, I'm obsessed with letters. You're going to get a good sense of that today. I really do love them as historical sources. They're really powerful points of connection. They afforded the exchange of news, affection, information across really great distances. And many of these letters have been used by historians to understand the conditions of the early colonies and how people lived in them. And in my own research, I've really used them largely to understand how writers' relationships with those overseas could cope with the immense emotional strain of separation. And I can also talk a bit more about this later. I will talk a bit more. And I think we can all agree that our long distance communication has become even more important in recent months. You know, we might be able to recognize some of these emotional challenges experienced by these Puritans as they embarked on their journeys that took them so far from their familiar land, their friends, their families, their support networks. They're really vibrant, deeply personal records, and they contain so much detail on the human experience as well as just things that were happening. You know, you get a sense of what people felt, and lived experience of historical actors is something that I really find very exciting. And I think these human experiences still really resonate today.
You made a great case that this is there's a sort of universal and present day resonance to all this. And I guess now I want to ask the flip side question, which is, was there a particularly Puritan use to these letters? And actually, I guess the broader question about what does it mean? Because I guess there's actually even controversy about, are the Plymouth colonists Puritans? I mean, how are you using the word Puritan, and how important is Puritanism in your whole study?
Yeah, oh gosh, it's a good question. So I use the word Puritan quite broadly, and this is something, I mean, I opened my PhD thesis, I think, with this sort of broad debate on what Puritanism was and wasn't. And I suppose I use it quite broadly to talk about a very, goodness me, this is where I lose my words. It's a spectrum of belief. These are people who had a very, very passionate, powerful belief in God, but I think we remember them quite poorly. But history has not been kind to Puritans. Over the centuries, they've developed a really, really bad reputation. We remember them as pious and serious, people who only ever wore black. They judged their neighbours for their really jovial pastimes. There was no dancing around the maypole or sports or fun or happiness in Puritan households. You know, these are the people that banned Christmas under Cromwell. They condemned sports games, dancing, gambling, card playing. They chastised people who didn't spend hours listening to lengthy sermons. We historically think of them as people who turned away from community pastimes, things that connected them to their neighbours. But actually, all of these negative ideas come from the Puritans' more mainstream neighbours and the people that didn't like them. So, of course, we end up with a negative impression because they were a minority. It's sometimes odd to think about when we think of these people as such a foundational part of early America as being actually such a small minority in England, but they represented a very tiny portion of the population. So it's not surprising then that we kind of get this quite negative idea. And these, you know, their neighbours, they're living amongst people with powerfully different religious ideas, who found it quite difficult to connect with their non-conforming neighbours. Because again, remember that these beliefs were technically illegal. They were frowned upon seriously by government and church. And it's kind of a case then about being inside or outside of community, and projecting feelings of difference. We see similar things in communities today. I think it all depends on perspective. So and again, as much as I'm obsessed with letters and correspondence, you may come to notice that I'm completely obsessed with Puritans, and I spend so much of my time trying to dispel these really negative ideas. So some of these things are true, yes, but I don't think we should use them to define all Puritan men and women. They were really passionate, loving and caring people. They had a really strong sense of community, a powerful commitment to their friends, to their families. And looking beyond this cold image of a strict and judgmental Puritan, we actually get a chance to uncover the intense commitment they had to sociable activities that empowered and sustained them. So just because they might not have enjoyed sports and games and dancing and those community pastimes, they had their own very strong community ideals themselves. So they were nonconformists, and that is something that we have to be aware of. In the early 17th century, they weren't allowed to openly practice their particular brand of Calvinist Protestantism. And this was characterized by a very vigilant commitment to God, to the Bible, a constant search for the truth in God's word. So they also weren't set in their beliefs. They changed them quite a lot, and that makes them even more difficult to define, because they kept changing their minds about God's truth and what the Bible meant. So you see these shifts over time as well. But they did share a dedication to ridding the Church of England from any Catholic influences, and they saw quite a few of them. Over the course of the 1620s and 30s, as I'm sure you're all very aware, the situation became increasingly untenable in England, pressure against them mounted, and it led ultimately to a period of mass emigration to New England, where many of them believed that they would establish a new world, one that they could follow God's word, however it may be shifting, in freedom. And I'm sure you're all very aware as well that the Mayflower pilgrims, they actually didn't go straight to New England. They started off in Leiden, and settled there quite happily for a short time, and then after again more pressure mounted there, they sought more distant shores and a more permanent location. So I guess today I'd really like to speak more generally about Puritans in the transatlantic world. So it's not just going to be on those that sailed on the Mayflower, and it sounds like you've had quite a lot of Mayflower talks, so maybe this will help kind of put them in the context of the wider Puritan transatlantic, because the experience of transatlantic separation as well was felt by all of these Puritans who emigrated. Despite the different dates and circumstances of their emigrations, there are really strong similarities in how they practice their long distance communication. So before I feel like I'm talking quite a lot now. I will hand back to Jeff in a moment, but before we follow these people to New England, then I'd really like to spend a bit of time speaking about the way that they practiced their sociable practices in England, these things that kept them connected as communities to one another. So there were pockets of Puritanism in England. They weren't necessarily everywhere, but there were little bits that we can really identify. England, Norfolk, Suffolk, Essex, London, predictably, Cambridgeshire, Lincolnshire, certain parts of the southwest and parts of the northeast. And I realise that sounds like I've basically listed the entire country, but they were, they were in small little sections of those areas. And actually what I find really fun, you can identify a lot of these areas if you look at the early place names in New England. So places like Boston, Plymouth, Bristol. We've even got Attleborough, Rockland, Hingham and Yarmouth over there. And a couple of really, really small villages where my dad was from in Norfolk, we found listed on the Pilgrim Monument in Provincetown once, which was very exciting. But yeah, so despite all these distances between them in England even, Puritans felt very connected to each other in their spirit. Their sense of community existed on different levels. So they were spiritual brethren, which kind of transcended earthly connection. But they were also members of parishes and communities that were tied to place and space. And because people did actually move around a surprising amount in early modern England, these bonds actually did cross borders into Wales, Scotland, Ireland, and even across mainland Europe. People were connected by blood, by marriage, by shared spaces, by friendship, by the conviction that they shared these same beliefs, and also just simple friendship. So I can definitely talk more about these later, but I'll hand back to hand back to you, Jeff, for the moment. But I love talking about these guys and what they were like in England. So, you know, if you have questions, I'll be happy to elaborate.
Okay, you sort of jumped ahead and answered a question that I was about to ask, but I realized actually my next two questions are actually related to each other, which is, you know, it's one of the questions that, you know, everybody studying American colonies wants to know, is how things change. And I think you've given us a sort of a background to the, you know, use of letters to maintain connections across England. How did things change when the distance became greater, and also when the whole experience of colonization in a sort of alien continent, how does that affect letter writing and the use of letters?
I think largely it just really slows it down. So there was a really long tradition of private gatherings in England where Puritan believers, I suppose, subscribers, could practice their religion in like sort of relative safety with like-minded people. They might travel or gad, it was called gadding, to other towns and villages. So people that didn't have access to a Puritan preacher, they might, you know, walk for a day to go and hear a particular preacher speak. There was John Cotton, who was based in Boston in Lincolnshire, and is mostly the reason for Boston, Massachusetts being named such. He actually once wrote a letter to his bishop when he was being accused of Puritan sympathies. He said, oh, the only reason that my parishioners can't kneel in church is because there's just so many of them that they can't fit in the doors, so they have to be standing. And kneeling at church was obviously, you know, it was a legal requirement then. So we do see a lot of people traveling to different places. And then, but of course, when you introduce distance, you can't just pop down the road and see, you know, Preacher Cotton talking. And like I said, because these people are so mobile, they were used to kind of traveling to see each other. So letters sustained these in-person practices in England. So they linked pockets of locality together. So John Winthrop, who led the 1630 voyage to New England, to Massachusetts, he often quite frequently continued in correspondence discussions that he'd started in person. So you get tiny little snippets of these conversations that he's just carrying on. So, for example, he was reminded, one of my examples here, by Sir William Masham in 1627, that they couldn't conclude their business until Masham's daughter Joan and his own wife were present. So they're doing their business slightly in person, they carry it on in the letter, and then they have to wait to conclude it until another point down the line. So the letter becomes part of physical interaction as well. And again, yeah, the following year, so 1628, Robert Crane thanked John Winthrop for news that he'd sent, but added that he'd prefer to discuss it further with him in person. So even for the lower ranks in the countryside, their realm of experience was much wider than their immediate parish, and the sharing of this godly life was very important to Puritan culture. So yeah, to kind of address this question of what changed, is that you lose these support networks instantly. Not everyone can read and write. I think that's the first thing we have to be aware of. So while we get these very complex and dynamic conversations that kind of happen across letters and in person, and these friendships that can be sustained because they see each other at church, what we have to remember is the moment that certain people emigrate, these groups split and sever, and all of a sudden you've got a minimum of a sort of 6-week distance. You can't just carry on a conversation. A lot of business has to happen in one letter, which, like I said at the beginning, it kind of gets split sometimes across 7 or 8 letters just to make sure that it reaches people, because they're dealing with trade, they're dealing with marriage deals, property. A lot of Puritans in the New World are writing back home to the people that are looking after their estate to make sure it's still being managed safely. And it was really daunting to people. You know, they knew how to communicate across the British Isles into the Netherlands, which, you know, wasn't that much further away. But the scale of the proposed difference and the barrier proposed by the Atlantic Ocean seemed so formidable by contrast. Traditional and really well-established practices of sociability were disrupted as the family units separated, as well as these parish units. And Puritans felt their support networks falling out from under them, and they lent on this spiritual community that was much more conceptual than it was, physical, obviously. So Priscilla Phones, who's one of my favourites, terribly dramatic woman. She's not obviously alive now. She wrote to her brother-in-law about the grief it has cost me. She said, the grief it has cost me when she heard of his decision to emigrate to New England. She acknowledged that it was God's will, and she knew that she should trust in him, but she feared the consequences of God's decision to, and I quote again, take away my props, that I may wholly rely on himself. So she sees it as a test. So God's actually removing her earthly support network. So she's now tested to just rely on him. And likewise, Margaret Winthrop, and again, I really love the Winthrop family. They're great fun. So you'll hear a lot about them today. She wrote to her husband that her grief was the fear of staying behind, because he was going on the first ship and she wasn't going to come. She wasn't going to sail for, I think it was 2 or 3 years before she sailed after him. She found the separation, and I quote, a very hard trial for me to undergo. And she wrote that if the Lord do not support and help me in it, I shall be unable to bear it. So with a challenge that great, they really did struggle to cope when they were separated from their friends and family. And just to, a little tidbit, some of my favorite stories, the Winthrops, John and Margaret, they promised, because they knew when he was on the ship that he wouldn't be able to write, and she knew she'd have to wait a very long time to hear from him. They made a vow that they would pray together at 6 p.m. every single day, so that they would meet in spirit, and they felt that would keep them sort of emotionally and spiritually connected when they couldn't actually use that kind of the paper and the pen to bring them together. And I think that's one of those things that just for me completely unseats this idea of these boring, miserable, grumpy Puritans. They're very loving, very passionate people.
Right. What about literally telling people in England about America, about describing America? How important is that as an agenda in the letters?
Oh, it's very important. Yeah, absolutely. They kind of had they had 2 jobs. The Mayflower Pilgrims and then later the Massachusetts immigrants as well. They saw themselves as having this duty to establish this new world and to let people know what it was like. There was also a bit of recruitment drive, I think. So a lot of the early letters you see, they're a really mixed bag. You've got more personal letters, maybe sent parents to children or children to parents, normally children to parents, like adult children to their parents, actually being honest about how awful things were. But then you've also got these kind of almost propaganda letters where people are saying, there's such an abundance of amazing wildlife. We can hunt, we can fish, we can do trade with these the native population. So yeah, loads of early letters from Plymouth to England hailed the quality of the land, which is kind of ironic when you remember how much they starved in that first year, but they don't obviously want to tell people that. They celebrated the new colony. They steered quite carefully, many of them, away from the contentious subject of religious freedom. So they picked and chose who they sent particular information to. The letters that have survived tend to be quite official in scope. I think the ones from Plymouth, particularly that historians use, they're more intended to inform than to provide emotional connection. So we don't get quite such a strong sense of the emotional strain of their separation from the Plymouth letters as we do in the later correspondence from England to Massachusetts. So I guess, for example, the letters that John Winthrop, I told you would come up again, and his friend Sir William Spring, they were writing back and forth on the eve of Winthrop's migration to Massachusetts. They're really quite emotional. I mean, I was way too close to these. I definitely shed a tear or two over some of these letters. I was way too close, but they serve as a really powerful reminder of the pain of this separation. So they show this spiritual connection. Winthrop declared to his friend William Spring, "My soul is knit to you." And he addressed God at the end of his letter, saying that he was leaving his friend William Spring in, and I quote, "in his arms who loves him best," meaning in God's arms. He asked God to bond the two men really tightly together, united to thee, make us one in the bond of brotherly affection. Let not distance weaken it, nor time waste it, nor change dissolve it, nor self-love eat it. So William's farewell brought with it, he said, the addition of forever. So again, we see the significance of this undertaking. Winthrop went never intending to return to England, and he never did. Quite a few people did, they went back and forth, but he never did. And he was able to find some comfort in the prospect of a continuing spiritual connection, as I've mentioned, hoping that when all other means of communion shall fail, let us delight to pray for each other. And this was obviously a big thing for him. So I guess I'll try not to, I keep not answering your questions, Jeff, I feel. But yeah, so they talked a lot about what was happening. Because they were reporting, they were sending news, they did want people to know how they were, but those kind of blocks of news, letters were quite formulaic often. You'd get a hello, how's the family, slightly more Puritan than that, but that was essentially the gist. And then you'd get a block of news, which was normally expected, and then at the bottom you'd get a much more personal, emotive section. So actually the letters that they write on just before they're about to leave, they don't fit that format. So that's why I think I was very drawn to them, and that's why I use them a lot, because they give us a different sense of what people were feeling. So when they get there, you kind of have to dig for these little tidbits amongst a lot of news and explanation. And sometimes they're just trying to work out what's going on. John Winthrop writes home a lot to find out what all of his sons are doing at various points across the country, and they're trying to keep track of all the people that they knew, because, you know, when you've got 6-7 weeks between letters, normally more, a few months, you actually also don't know if people have died. So John Winthrop, there's 3 letters in his collection, in his archive, that arrived with him after he died, and the one that always gets me, and this is definitely when I shed a tear over, is the one that just says, oh, I hope you're feeling better, I heard that you're not ill anymore, and that's great. And you can just imagine his poor young wife having to open that, and it's just, oh, I can't handle those things, I don't know, too emotional for me.
Okay, my next question, I don't know whether this is, I mean, I think this is a difficult one, but you've hinted at, you know, that the character of the Plymouth letters are different, and it may be because just which letters survived, or you know, the Plymouth letters are different. But is there a way using these letters to see a difference between Plymouth and Massachusetts?
I think there is, because I think the Ventures were intending to do different things. So I guess when I say that these outpourings of sentiment are more common in the Massachusetts letters than they are in the Plymouth ones, I certainly don't want to imply that the Plymouth Puritans felt things less powerfully. We get lovely little sparks of detail, like a guy called Robert Cushman wrote to his friend Edward Southworth. So I'm having to read some of these names because there's so many of them. He wrote in 1620, when he was waiting for his ship to Plymouth to set sail. He was convinced, Cushman, that he was about to die. So he sent a kind remembrance, is what he called it, to Southworth and his wife, with the expectation that, and I quote, "whom in this world I never look to see again." He wrote about the expected dangers of the voyage. He added that an infirmity of body has seized me, which will not in all likelihood leave me till death. And he described his affliction as a bundle of lead crushing my heart more and more. So Cushman's quite clearly a slightly dramatic man. He was fine. He did not die on the voyage. He did not die in this moment. Unfortunately, he didn't last much longer after he got to Plymouth. I think he died in 1625. But yeah, so he's got like pragmatism and emotion. He reports on why the voyage has been delayed. There was damage to the ship. He talks about how frightened he is that they'll never be able to settle a new colony because of these setbacks. But bookending that detail are these more kind of personal additions. So he said, you know, remember me in all love to our friends, as if I named them, whose prayers I desire earnestly and wish again to see. But not till I can with more comfort look them in the face, because of course he was convinced he was dying. It is a difficult question, Jeff. Thanks for that. I think they are doing different things. I think the Plymouth Pilgrims felt a big weight on their shoulders because they felt like they'd been running for a really long time, and when they got to Plymouth, they knew they had to recruit quickly because they were dying in huge numbers. And I think they also had to perform much stronger sense of religious conformity back to officials in England to be able to keep their right to stay in America. So I think that's why we get more of a sense of formality and rigidity from their letters than we do in Boston, because there was already kind of a precedent there. So they did also have to pretend that they were a lot less radical in their religious beliefs than they were. But the Plymouth Puritans were the most radical. They were the separatists. And then the Massachusetts Puritans were a bit less radical. So this kind of sliding scale of belief that I was talking about, they sit at different points on it. And I think as well, then, you raised this point as well, Jeff, it is also about collections. So a couple of the Plymouth Pilgrims are very, very well remembered, well regarded, but we actually don't have as many of their letters surviving. The Winthrops were prolific correspondents, and there were loads of them as well. They were a really large family. So they wrote and they stored their letters because they viewed themselves as a very important part of history. Winthrop very much saw himself as someone who was settling. He called it a city upon a hill. It was an example state that everyone across Europe would be looking to, and that they would emulate it and create their own perfect states based on that model. So he very much had a strong sense of his own family history and his own narrative. He kept a really tedious diary. So he very much he stored all these letters, and that's why we've got so many of them. So that 1,600 odd letters I said I'd read, 90% of those come from the Winthrop collection, because they were just, and they had a lot of money that they could then store them.
Okay, well, this is the last question I'm going to ask you. I know that you could go on a long way about this.
I'm sorry.
It's the methods question. I mean, how do you? I mean, we all know how to read one letter and sort of figure out what's going on within the letter. Or we at least have a sense of how you would do that. How do you study letters in that kind of bulk? What does it do to the way you approach the source?
Yeah, it does change it. I've spoken to historians of correspondence who've got this collection of 30 letters. They talk about how big a collection that is. We're actually, it's quite rare that we get it in this period, these enormous collections. So I just read them, and I don't think that was a strong methodology, and it's not something I would recommend to another PhD student. I read what I could get my hands on, and then I read them chronologically. So I started in 1600 and just read through. And because I was doing a PhD and I had the time, and again, this is something that everyone tells you when you're doing your PhD, that you'll never again have this much time to do research, and you don't believe them, but it's absolutely true. I read chronologically. I took notes of every single thing that happened in every single letter, and I have this giant database now of all of these letters that I have in detail, and then I categorize them thematically. So for me, one of the methods that I use, and I can talk more about this if anyone wants to ask questions, but it's kind of more of a weird historian thing that I do that not many people are that interested in. I do something called social network analysis. So I actually use computer programming to map all of these letters. So I've got lots and lots of dots on thankfully a computer program did this for me. I tried to do it myself on a pin board once and it was just impossible. But so you get to see who was writing to who and when, and you get these very large dots of people that got lots and lots of letters, and very small dots of people who are right on the outside. And it's a very clever program that and analyzes it all, so you can see where the letters were traveling and the networks. yes, sorry, back on subject. Yeah, it's difficult. It's difficult to deal with a collection this large, but when you have the capacity to read through like this, you're not looking for something in particular. And I think that was what was really interesting to me, is that I wasn't just researching war. I wasn't just researching trade. So I wasn't looking for keywords. I actually have the privilege of just reading a lot of things that people said and getting a sense of what they felt. And gradually themes started emerging. So now I've got this big spreadsheet, which I love. I love spreadsheets. I can word search on that and I can find things and I can easily pull stuff out. And then it was just a case of working out what the PhD was going to be about. So I used the letters to kind of explore how people mediated conflict between each other, and about how, you know, they dealt with how far away from each other they were. So I guess to try and, I guess, finalize my thoughts, and then perhaps we can kind of open up to questions, because I can see a few popping up in the chat, and that'll stop me just from just babbling about Puritans all night. So I guess let's come back to that first example, that promise that Winslow made to his friend, that he would write with news and information at every available opportunity. And remember, there aren't that many opportunities available, but the vow shows us how valuable information from abroad was to these recipients and how difficult it could be to obtain. Winslow's willingness to keep writing without a response shows that he knew that letters might miscarry. Correspondence wasn't always a straightforward exchange. And this is, again, something that I learned by reading all of the letters rather than just a few, because it's not something that you notice in every single one, because you rarely get both sides of a letter exchange. I've got a lot of the things that people sent to John Winthrop, but not quite so much of what he sent back to England, unless he had someone there collecting the letters, for example. So some people sent 5 or 6 letters before they received any in return. Others fired off lots of tiny, short little letters going aboard the same ship, which was, you know, docked in port. They didn't know when it was going to sail, so they would send the letter with the most important information and get it onto the ship. And then they'd write one with a few more things that they added that they wanted, you know, they just remembered and they wanted to know. And you might get 5 or 6 of these going on the same ship. There was a man called Edward Howes that was the worst for it. And they weren't short letters either. They were pages and pages, very dull man. But yes, so they prioritize their information. So I guess I'll try and wrap up my thoughts. It was really difficult to do this kind of communication in the early years of the New England colonies, but it was absolutely instrumental in sustaining this feeling of shared experience. So there's a historian that called it a dense and cross-hatched web of connections that span the Atlantic Ocean. People, like I said earlier, they were connected by blood, by marriage, by their former shared spaces, by friendship, and the conviction that they shared the same beliefs as well. The web of links sustained micro-communities in England, in New England, and across the Atlantic. And it did that by facilitating communication that somehow made up for their lack of physical closeness. So a lot of people did actually talk about the way they would touch the page and feel the page. Margaret Winthrop used to comment on the fact that she had to stop herself from crying because her tears were blurring the ink. You know, we get these really beautiful little material nuggets as well. So yeah, my main point, I suppose, I would like to leave us on is that the correspondence was central to the continuation of these sociable practices that Puritans had in England and in Europe. And they overcame immense challenges to maintain these. So as much as it was important to them, I think it should be important to us as historians as well. And I'll leave it there.
Okay, well, thanks. Do you have the chat in front of you? Are you willing
yes,
to
I
just
can
sort of
see it.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to mute myself again then. This was terrific. Thank you very much. And right.
Cheers, Jeff. So I've got the first question here. Is there evidence in the letters of empathy with the indigenous people or vice versa? Racism, talk of savages, etc. I mean, it's a really good question, actually, and it's varied. If you look at very early correspondence, quite often they talk about the native population. They use the word salvages, and at a certain point that L just gets dropped out, so we do also see the word savages. And that's quite variable depending on how relations with them were going at the time. If things were positive, great, salvages, but they still, in calling them that, they saw this population not as people in their own right who had their own ideas and belief systems, but as people who they could convert to what they saw as the proper, the one true belief system. So it is a really complex relationship, and there are scholars who have done much more work on this than me, so I would hate to say anything too conclusive, because it's actually not something I focused on too heavily. There's a lot of reports of tension and war, but there's, amongst the Winthrop letters in particular, they kind of do recognize individual tribes, as some of them being ones they worked with, some they didn't work with. So there's no sense of like tarnishing everyone with the same brush. They did understand the nuances of tribal relationships, but they were fraught relationships, and they could turn in an instant, because obviously the English have a very different sense of land ownership as well. So they thought they were paying for land and buying land in a way that the native population certainly didn't think they were selling it. So things could turn on a sixpence. But yeah, I hope that answers that question. And I'm sorry if not. Feel free to kind of elaborate on it in the chat if you want me to go into more detail. All right. Oh, I'm scrolling too quickly. So I've got a question. I'm correct, or am I correct in assuming that the majority of letters were written by wealthy, educated Puritans with a biased viewpoint based on their class? And then as a second part, do you think that those unable to correspond settled better or faster because they didn't have the same contact with relatives? Oh, that's interesting. I hadn't thought of that. Okay, I'll take the first part. The Puritans are an interesting bunch because they did cross, and we don't necessarily talk about class in this period because they didn't use that word. They had sorts of people, so you had better or upper, middling, and lower sorts of people, and that was kind of the language they used. But it roughly translates on what we would understand as a class system. The Puritans are really interesting because they actually they were very educated. They came very largely from a sort of middling rank. There were poorer Puritans, there were richer Puritans, there were lots of richer Puritans, but they, as a group, tried to educate themselves and their children to move upwards socially. So we do actually see quite a lot of Puritans with the ability to read and write that isn't necessarily representative of the general population in England at the time. But you can also read in these letters, and it's one of the things that I love about using early modern correspondence, is that you can tell how much of an education a person has had by how it's written, because there's no dictionary at this point, so there's no sort of set spellings. So people just kind of write phonetically, they write what they can hear, and and some people kind of understand how to make the words fit that, and some people don't. So I think your question about the sort of the viewpoint based on their class is kind of interesting, because these are privileged people. If they had the money to emigrate, they've actually got quite a lot of property and possession. But because they were all kind of a sort of rough class level, you don't get much of a sense of it in the letters, because they're talking to people who they felt were their social equals a lot of the time, until you start developing a government system in New England, where they would then obviously, even if they're of the same kind of class level, the respect that they would give to their authorities and things shifted things. And it's a project I'd love to do. And I don't know if I'm going to have the chance, but there's a trait in early modern letter writing, and not everyone did it, but if you wrote the address in one part of the page, it meant you were writing to your superior, and if you wrote it in a different part of the page, you were writing to your inferior, and the same for where you would sign. So you do get a sense of how people kind of understood their relationship in between one another in that, but I haven't been able to really get into that with my letters just yet. yeah, the second part, that's so interesting, whether people who couldn't write actually find it easier to settle. I don't know. And I've not thought of it because obviously we don't hear from those people, but they must have had to make use of their immediate connections in a way that they couldn't. But what you do see a lot of, like, letters weren't private in the same way that they are today. Someone would kind of, quite often, if you couldn't write, you would approach someone who could, and then they would write a letter on your behalf to like a group of people in England, and then that would be read out, or the information passed along, or you might ask someone to include your letter in a packet to someone else, and then it would get sent on. So they had other ways of staying connected, even if they couldn't write. But that is really interesting, and I don't have an answer, but I think I will think more on that. So thank you for that one, Carol. Right. So yes, I guess this one connects. Surely most people traveling at this time were quite wealthy, but some of mine went to be with, I guess, is that some of your family went to be with Mormons or ancestors, and those left behind worried no end about those, and yet became far wealthier and happier than those who worried about them. Oh, I see the question. I see the that was a follow-on question. Yeah, I would love to be able to answer that more detail, and I wonder if that's something I need to dig outside of the letters, which is a difficult thing for me to admit to myself, that I might have to use other sources. But yeah, that's very interesting. Okay, yeah, how letters were distributed, no system of post offices. Right, absolutely. What was the cost implication for distributing letters once ships arrived in port? I don't know quite about the functionality, but there were letter bearers. And so most people would know a local letter bearer who would come to your house, pick up your letters, take them to where they needed to go. And so actually a lot of addresses, they're not addresses like we would know now. It's sent to someone in New England, to John Winthrop in New England, to the governor in New England, things like that. And because there weren't obviously as many people, it was easier for letters to find their destination. So you would generally know someone who was willing to carry your letter. So some people were kind of employed as letter bearers. Other times you might have someone coming to visit, and they are moving on from, let's say, Essex to London, and you know that the ships are going to go out from London, so you might hastily write a letter to make sure it goes with that person to London, and then it would go on from there. But this is what I mean, like, there's no guarantee that anything's getting anywhere. And there was a part of my research actually where I actually looked at trust in letter bearers and who was being trusted to carry certain things. And some people wrote in code because they couldn't trust their letter bearers not to read the letter. So they wrote in like a secret code that they would send a cipher in a different letter to make sure that that no one could work it out. And in New England, one of the things that was really interesting was that quite often colonists would employ Indian or Native American letter bearers because they couldn't read the English language. So it was another security measure, so they could write more freely. And the cost implication, I actually don't know too much about that. And again, there are really brilliant historians that work on this. To my knowledge, and this is something I should definitely learn more about, the largest cost implication was the actual paper and ink. And beyond that, you'd pay like a small fee for people to carry them. And I think in general ships would probably charge a haulage. I don't know. I should look that up. I'm going to make a note of that. Thank you. And again, if I'm not answering these questions very well, please do put follow-ups in the chat that I can kind of come back to. All right, I got a question from Anthony. I was wondering if there were any conflicts between individual pilgrims regarding making contact with England. Some of the more radical Brownist writers described England as a land so corrupt that the only way to maintain a connection to God was by completely separating themselves from England. Would these more extreme pilgrims have disapproved of their companions keeping contact, or did the feeling of separation cool them down? Now, I don't know any specific examples. That is a really interesting one. I imagine there probably were people that felt incredibly strongly about that. the more challenging conflicts when people left Plymouth and the rest of New England to go home because they couldn't hack it, or because it wasn't what they wanted. There's a lot of condemnation around people leaving. John Winthrop writes this really violent letter. He gets quite angry in his old age, does John. He writes a really, really angry letter to someone in England to say, oh, this ship left with all of these people abandoning us on it, and they all drowned on the journey, and good riddance to them. He essentially says that God had like condemned them for abandoning them. I just seen there was an amendment to this. As well as a feeling of separation, would the need to keep a strong sense of community also have cooled down any of the more radical pilgrims from scolding those who kept contact with friends, who chose to stay in England? So yeah, there's a huge part of my research focused on how people actually dealt with these feelings. These really, because they were conflicted people. Puritans were really anxious. I actually feel quite sorry for them sometimes. They did it to themselves as well, but they were very anxious people. They constantly regulated their communities. They were always checking in on their neighbours, evaluating people's actions, and making sure that people were staying very much inside of these parameters of acceptable beliefs, behaviour, and other actions. So I think they did feel very tied to one another, because another thing that happened in the New England churches is they swore into church communities. So once you got off the boat, you weren't actually immediately accepted into a church. You weren't necessarily a member right away. So you had to then, after a period of, I guess, living in the community where you weren't allowed to receive the Lord's Supper, you would still attend the church, but you weren't necessarily like a sworn-in member of the community. You would have to kind of often sit in front of a council of everyone who was a member of the church, and they would test you on your acceptability to join the community. And as a community, they would accept or deny members based on how acceptable or unacceptable their belief systems were and their actions were, their behaviour. So once they were sworn in, they all signed a covenant, and these covenants bound them together. So I think your point about like would the sort of need to establish these strong senses of communities have kind of ameliorated conflict, I think yes. And you see it quite a lot actually, communities jumping into action to defend members against slander or against other shame. They help each other financially, they help each other with spiritual guidance. They were very, very much connected to one another. And I think that's another reason that when people did leave, they felt abandoned, because these are people that they've brought into their hearts and into their spaces. And when people start to leave, many of them got these kind of crises of confidence, like, am I doing the right thing? Am I doing the wrong thing? Where should I, where should I go? Where should I be? So yeah, they were constantly grappling with these things. And I'm speaking very generally, which is probably a bit unfair on them, because they were obviously very, personal shades of difference. But yeah, I'm sure there were people that got really cranky if someone was writing back to England. But I think they also knew that if you had family there, family was still a really important community bond, just as much as sort of religion as well. Right, final question on my list. Oh, The Tempest. I love The Tempest. It's a great play. Treatment of Caliban as a savage slave, filth as thou art. Yeah. Yeah, The Tempest. There's a storm. I think actually this was in some of the letters that I read. There is a storm that people encountered, I think, going to Barbados, which inspired The Tempest, inspired Shakespeare to write The Tempest. So I don't know that it was necessarily like the sort of mainland America, but it was very much part of the cultural, socio. My goodness, I can't speak, I'm running out of brain. The socio-cultural context of knowledge in England and how people understood these kind of different lands, because they did anything that people in this period didn't understand, they felt frightened of, I think is fair to say. And that's why a lot of this anxiety, you know, I said they were anxious people, a lot of the anxiety comes from the fact that they're suddenly transplanted into a completely different space where they don't understand the culture, they don't know the landscape, they don't know how big this place is, they don't know if they'll even make it across the water on a ship. And then they hear these reports of savages in different areas and stuff, and it is terrifying. One of the shipmasters that I write about a lot, William Pierce, he ends up actually being killed on a ship because they just land on an island that used to be hospitable but now wasn't, and everyone on the ship was murdered in a conflict. So on that happy note, I guess I'll finish there. So if there's any more questions, do drop them in, but otherwise I'll hand back, I think.